You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. If it sounds like you're hearing us in high fidelity today, as they used to say, that's partly due to the new microphones we're using today from Audio-Technica. The good folks at AT have loaned us 3 BP40 large diaphragm dynamic broadcast microphones to use for a few episodes. And if I may say so myself, it's exciting to have such a spiffy gear to use in our home studios. Needless to say, it's both a pleasure and an honor to have Audio-Technica on board as a B&H Photo Podcast sponsor. That said, today, John and I welcome not one, not two, but 3 guests to the show to talk about a photographer and a recent photo book that I'm simply nuts over. Let me tell you, it's a real treat to host a podcast and be able to make conversations like this come to being, and with an audience nonetheless. I'm a lucky guy, what can I say? The book we're talking about today is called Todd Webb in Africa, Outside the Frame. And the photographer, as you might guess, is Todd Webb. And we're joined by Betsy Evans-Hunt, the executive director of the Todd Webb Archive in Portland, Maine. We also welcome Aimée Bessire and Erin Hyde Nolan, who are the co-authors of this new book. Betsy is also a former gallery director and worked for a spell as a studio manager for Robert Mapplethorpe. Erin is a professor at Maine College of Art and an art historian who specializes in the visual culture of the Islamic world. Aimée is a professor of art and photography at Bates College, specializing in African and ancient Near Eastern art. These are just some of the reasons why this book is not only chock full of incredible imagery, but it's such a wonderful and scholarly document about an astute photographer's trip to Africa in the late 1950s. As a bonus, there's also a terrific backstory to go along with this collection of photographs. Stay tuned. Thank you all for joining us today. Betsy, I want to dig into this book and the archive itself, but first, can you give us a little background on Todd Webb? I don't know how many of our listeners are familiar with him. I was not at all familiar with him until I got this book, and then was just blown away. And here's a guy who was a commercial photographer back in the 50s and somehow found himself on a really cool dream assignment in Africa in the late 50s. Could you give us some story to go along with this?
Well, so Todd started out being a photographer sort of late in his career. He was about 39. He was working for Chrysler, and he just as a middle manager, and he and his best friend, Harry Callahan, joined the Chrysler Camera Club, and they took a 10-day course from Ansel Adams. And at that point, they both decided that photography was going to be their life. Todd then joined the Navy and was a photographer down in New Guinea. Ansel Adams put him in touch with Alfred Stieglitz during that time via letter, and Todd went to visit Stieglitz in 1943. They had an incredible meeting whereby Todd was looking at a John Marin show, and he must have said all the right things. So Stieglitz just adored Todd from the start, which was very lucky. And Todd had taken some of his first photographs were of some African-American family in Detroit. And so he was going to show them to Dorothy Norman for inclusion in her publication twice a year. So that all went swimmingly well and started off a friendship between Stieglitz and Todd and a correspondence. All of this is at Yale University archive. And then, of course, he got to know O'Keeffe, and she just loved him sort of like a brother. They had a very just down-to-earth relationship. So Todd was really not a commercial photographer. He really, he ended up having to be, of course, but he always wanted to be an art photographer. And he had his first one-man show at the Museum of the City of New York in 1946.
Until, I don't know, maybe the late 60s, photography was not taken seriously by a lot of people in the art world. I mean, you could buy an Ansel Adams print for $100 and they would look at you laughing that, you just paid $100 for a photograph.
You're right, but there was also, do you remember there was sort of the FSA with, Roy Stryker?
Oh, yes.
And then Roy Stryker actually his next job was for Standard Oil. And so Todd, along with, Gordon Parks and Walker Evans and various other FSA people were working for Roy Stryker from like 46 to 48 for the Standard Oil sort of propaganda, really, basically, of, why oil is great for your life. But they all, it was at this whole club. So yes, you're right in terms of it being sort of a collectible art form. But remember, Family of Man was in the early, mid 50s.
Point taken.
And Stieglitz had been working for 150 years at that point.
Yeah. So in any event, so Todd was he just was in love with photography. And he started out really as a large format photographer also, which is pretty interesting because he was walking around New York with a 5x7 and an 8x10.
Wow.
And later a 4x5 handheld. But he, any given day, he only had, 6 or 7 pieces of film. So it's his work is wonderful in that regard. But
was that his style mostly? Did he set out for a day with a large format or medium format camera? The number of film that he had, and just kind of hit the streets.
Exactly.
Was that his working method normally?
It was, and so he'd visit Stieglitz, every other day and show him what he had and that sort of thing. But he lived in Harlem, and he'd take the 125th Street streetcar across to the 3rd Avenue L. So you see, there's a lot of 125th Street, there's a lot of 3rd Avenue L, and there's a lot of down sort of Lower East Side, Orchard Street, and that kind of stuff. So yeah, those were his favorite haunts. And then he went to Europe in 1947, 48, and he worked for the Marshall Plan, which is something that Roy Stryker also got him hooked up with. So he was in Paris from 48 to about 52. And then he came home and had a dearth he'd sort of lost a lot of his New York connections. And so he was getting some commercial work with Fortune and that sort of thing. And he decided to apply for a Guggenheim to walk across America. And so he applied for the Guggenheim in 54. And in 1955, he received it. And the people who wrote his recommendations were Steichen, Walker Evans, Georgia O'Keeffe, amongst others. But of course, 1955 was also the year that Robert Frank,
right, exactly,
drove across America, and his recommendation was also written by Walker Evans. So that's a whole nother subject of another.
That's funny you mention that, because I have that in my notes as a little side conversation, which of course would take a whole episode. But to compare the two works that were made on these epic trips across the country at the same time.
In fact, that's going to happen in a show at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston in 2023.
Wonderful. Just the two, Todd and
Robert.
Yep. Frank. Wonderful.
Yep. So, and that was work that was also sort of that I just discovered in 2017 when I discovered the Africa work. So
Frank's work that's the work everyone knows. Nobody knows of Webb's work of the walk. Am I correct about that or no?
You're absolutely right, because I hadn't seen it. Nobody'd seen it till 2016 when I discovered these trunks with all this other stuff in it. So.
Which we're going to come to that part of the story too.
Let's get to it. Before we get to how he got this assignment in Africa in the late 50s, can you talk a little bit about the work that you're describing, starting the archive, how that worked out, and of course, finding the material that we're talking about?
Well, I moved to Portland in 1988. I had a brief stint in the antiques business, and then I decided that wasn't for me. And so I had this history of working in, photo galleries and then for Mapplethorpe. So, and this is the late 80s. So it was still kind of nascent in terms of galleries. And I knew all the players. I was young, but I was fortunate enough to have sort of met, Harry Lunn and, everybody. So I was able to open a gallery and get this is incredible work on consignment. So my first show was Robert Frank. My second show was Elliot Porter. My third show was Walker Evans, and on and on. And so this couple who were in their 80s, who lived in Bath, Maine, would come to every show, and they said, "Oh, we knew Ansel. Oh, we knew Walker. Oh, we knew Elliot." And then finally I was like, "Who are you guys?" And it was Todd and Lucille Webb. So it was just incredible. And they just entered my life. Todd, they married late in life and didn't have children. Todd had a terrible turn with a dealer in the 1970s who sort of stole most of his work from him, and had enough money to live off. They always lived very simply. So by the time I met him, he didn't care to sell another photograph in his life. He had such a bad taste in his mouth about the whole thing. So it took a number of years. And we sort of built up a trust. And I just did I think it was just a 3-month trial of like, let me sell some work and make sure you get paid and, see how you feel about it. And so that started about 1990.
What kind of work was he showing at that point in time?
So the most popular really were the New York photographs from the 40s.
Okay.
And so I had relationships. I was a private dealer at this point, but I had relationships with people like Yancey Richardson in New York and Robert Klein in Boston and Scheinbaum and Russick in Santa Fe and, 3 or 4 other dealers around the country. So they sold mostly the New York, and then some of the O'Keeffe material. And then a little bit of Paris as well. And so they mostly sold the work for me, and I was sort of acted as a wholesaler. And I did a tremendous amount of work with Yancey Richardson in New York in the 90s of selling the New York material. She did just a great job with that. So everybody was happy.
Okay. And then one day you discovered some photographs that, hey, were taken by Mr. Webb. Tell us about this.
I had been working with Sean Corcoran, the curator at the Museum of the City of New York, on a show for many, many years. Erin could talk about that. But we finally garnered a show of this kind of the reprise of his 1946 show. So I knew I was going to have a big museum show. And I knew also I had a book deal with Thames and Hudson for the New York book, I See a City. So I knew that he was going to enter sort of the next realm of, notoriety and fame. And I knew this stuff was lurking out there. Todd had talked about it. He never really wanted to go after these people. He was, he's a very humble guy, and he never was certainly not litigious. But I felt like things would come up on eBay and, various other auction sites that were, some good work. Anyway, I decided to track it down. So I kind of knew where it was also. I kind of inherited Todd's reluctance to just deal with the whole thing, but I figured this was the time. So I tracked it down, and there's a guy in Berkeley, California, who had bought sort of most of the work from the original dealer. And he and 2 other colleagues. So I went out to Berkeley and I said, well, so how many pictures are there? And he said, well, there are a lot. So he led me to a room with about 1,000 pictures of O'Keeffe, which were gorgeous. And I thought, well, that's probably it. And he said, no, there's more. So off we go to Oakland, and a basement, and a dry basement, thankfully, 5 large steamer trunks full of photographs, negatives, journals, ephemera. I mean, it's Todd's whole life. And it was so incredible to me. It was hard for me to kind of keep my...
And
how was your heart pumping at that moment? I can imagine it was like pounding through your chest, and your eyeballs are probably coming out of your head, right?
Yeah, no, it was. And I was also trying to keep my cool because, I had consulted with some lawyers. And I did actually, Todd and Lucille had, where they were like 19th century clerks. So I had a lot of paperwork, that could have sort of indicted all these guys. But it just was said, it's not going to work. It's going to be expensive and you may not get it, and that kind of thing. And so I just took 3 or 4 trips out there actually to California and built a relationship with these guys. And they had known Todd and Lucille. And so, I just appealed to their better natures. And I just said, wouldn't it be nice to have this all reunited? And, I'm going to do the right thing with it. And, you'll rest more easily. And
how much of his body of work did that represent that was out there in California?
I would say, so when I inherited the estate, I thought I'd gotten, thankfully, most of the negatives I already had, well, a lot of the negatives of New York and Paris and O'Keeffe. But I'd say it's at least probably 50% or more.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. So.
Was there any unprocessed film, or was everything already processed and documented and just sitting there?
No unprocessed film, but
okay.
But there were the Africa work was all just negatives.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
and it was kept in decent shape by the folks. Or
by luck? By luck, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, they did. It was kind of cute. These guys are in their late 70s now, and they're all sort of California dudes. So they had it. In these steamer trunks in manila envelopes with like a big, huge padlocks on them. in his basement. But I mean, it's just luck that it was on a hill in Oakland that just didn't seem to have ever had any moisture. I think they thought they were doing the right thing, and thankfully it ended up being the right thing. So
now, who had seen the African photos?
Nobody. There were some black and white photographs. There's one or two that Todd loved and were published in a couple of earlier books of his, of a young mother in Togo, I think, or Tanzania. And there were about 3 or 4 other black and whites that I had seen, but no one had ever seen any of it.
Jeez. Actually, a very small portion of the photographs. He took thousands of photographs there. He was out there for 4 or 5 months in a bunch of countries, and the ultimate use, again, it was the UN that hired him to do this. They put out a really horrible little black and white, almost like a little pocket, like a little vest pocket brochure, using photographs that barely caught the spirit of what he did, let alone none of the color. I think it's important to note right now that we're talking about a photographer who went out and spent some time taking photographs in Africa, totally wide-eyed. He had very little idea about what to expect. He had preconceptions, but reality was different. He captured it amazingly. The photographs are graphically striking, phenomenal compositions, wonderful use of color. Very powerful photographs. There's also amazingly good black and white. And as you mentioned, he was shooting medium and large format. So the tonality and everything, the formality is gorgeous. It's pictures of another time, another era, and they're very unique. And what I'm wondering is, did these pictures stand out compared to his earlier work, or are these just sort of a continuation of a style that he already established? Because it's real strong.
Well, I think first of all, he did work in color, but I've not seen any other color work by him, but we have notations in his journal and that sort of thing that he had been, working with color since the early 50s, but mostly was black and white. These are in some ways a huge departure, and in some ways they're not. I think they're very much informed by the fact that he was a large format photographer. So there's just the way they're composed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But there's nothing at all like them. I don't know. Aimée and Erin can talk about that perhaps, but they feel like Todd to me. I'm not sure how much more I could say, but it's the directness, the honesty of the gaze, the composition. But I'd never seen any color and no square format before either. So
right.
Did he speak about the work to you or to anybody else in any sense of how he thought about the work looking back, or something he had hoped would happen to the work, or it just something that was kind of left in the past?
It was pretty much left in the past, although we have in his journal is voluminous, which is another crazy thing. It's 1,400 pages. And so we have tons of references in his journal. Even before he left, he was hoping to make a book of this work. And then as he came home, he did, but I think you may have read in the book, it's just that nobody wanted this view of Africa.
Before we get on to the book and more about the images themselves, I want to ask Betsy about the archive, what the plans are, is it publications that keep you going? Was there an endowment? How is the archive set up, and what are the plans?
So it really evolved very organically. When Todd and Lucille turned to be about 90 years old, they just looked at me and they said, we'd like you to have everything. And so I was, obviously very honored and also a little frightened by all of it. But I really, it was a family situation. I mean, we were very much I was very much their surrogate daughter by this point. And so I, quite frankly, have been through, so Todd died in 2000, and Lucille died in 2008. She was 102 when she died.
Wow.
My job really, as I see it, is to put him on the map. I feel as though for various reasons, and one was this dealer who will remain unnamed, who took his work in the 70s, who just never did him any favors. So he didn't, he missed all that sort of late rise in the 70s and 80s. And, when, as you mentioned, the photography was really taking hold. And so my job is to really just get him on the map. And so I want to do books and museum shows for each of the bodies of work. So now, we've done New York and now we've done Africa. And then, as I mentioned, the 1955 work is going to be shown at Houston, and we'll travel, and there'll be a publication for that. And then the O'Keeffe material, I have work scheduled with the O'Keeffe Museum to do a show and a book. And the last major sort of tenet is the pictures from Paris, and I haven't quite figured out who's going to do that yet. So as I mentioned, I'm 64. By the time I'm 70, I want to have all that done. And so what sustains us, there was a small endowment from Todd and Lucille. And we do sell photographs. We do a pretty good job of that.
You make new prints. You're making new prints for
we
order,
make new prints, but I have a ton of beautiful vintage work. Okay. So that's what we mostly sell. But obviously, the Africa work is all new prints, and we do have some estate prints that we sell of popular images that we don't have any more vintage work of.
It's wonderful that you were able to salvage this stuff and save it and make it available for a new generation of people to appreciate.
Thank you so much. Todd and Lucille are smiling. They definitely struggled, and they had a modicum of success, but they certainly hopefully will get there. So
that's it. We are going to take a short break, and we come back with Aimée, Erin, and Betsy with more about Todd Webb in Africa outside the frame. Stay tuned. This episode of the B&H Photography Podcast is produced using Audio-Technica microphones. Check the link in our show notes for the Audio-Technica product page on the B&H website. Okay, we're back. We've been totally ignoring Aimée and Erin, and it's kind of a cruel little joke we do. We invite people on the show, and then we ignore them. Anyway, we're back. So what was the first or seemingly most daunting task when first approaching this project? It could be from an art or scholarly point of view. Aimée, let's start with you, okay? Give us your approach on this.
Actually, in a way to answer that, I would say almost the first most exciting part was seeing the images. The images were just so incredible, and seeing early color photography of the African continent during this colonial moment, the moment between colonialism and independence, was incredibly exciting. But then when we were thinking about it, also, there was the daunting task, I think, would be how do you show all of this material and do it in a thoughtful way that's also thinking about this moment that we're in, considering racial justice and looking from the lens of colonialism and post-colonialism on this project in the continent of Africa. How do we look at an outsider going to Africa during the colonial era and photographing, and how do we present that thoughtfully and sensitively? And one of the things that was really critical, and I would love Erin to add in here as well, but critical for us, was the fact that we didn't feel that we could do this without including African voices in the project. And Erin, do you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, I would just add to Aimée's wonderful comments that we felt that from its inception, the project needed to be collaborative. And while we were organizing the project, we felt strongly that it needed to include multiple voices, and many from the African continent. And so our invitation to different authors for the book was a really important part of that collaboration. And we felt like that was kind of the only way forward to really address and confront this body of work as a record of the colonial era and post-colonial moment in 1958. One thing that was remarkable about this body of work was that it was essentially handed to us in a steamer trunk, right? Like all of it, these undeveloped or these unprinted negatives, rather, these ephemera, his journals, his letters to Lucille. And it's so unusual as a researcher and a scholar to have nearly everything in one place. and not have to, do these sort of, especially in the context of this project, like have to recover these from the depths of library vaults or something. And so the fact that Betsy had done all of this incredible sleuthing to recover the work, and for us to have kind of unlimited access to it, really facilitated the project in a way that we couldn't have imagined, and I have not experienced anywhere else.
And can I ask then, did you, when you, or to both of you, when you were at that stage, when you were opening the trunk and looking at it, were you thinking about this in terms of art historians, in terms of archivists, photo lovers, scholars on African art? What was your immediate thoughts, and where did you think, okay, this is how we need to take it? Did it end up kind of being what you had hoped, the book?
This is Aimée. I think I started shaking. I was so excited, and I was actually not just unloading I wasn't looking at them from the steamer trunk directly, but looking at them on a screen. Sam Walker who works with Betsy, had already scanned a number of the negatives, and I was looking at them with Sam on the computer screen and was just enthralled. And
you must be like a kid in a candy store at that point. That's my guess.
That's what it felt like. And I do remember, I remember my whole body almost vibrating. I was so excited. And as Erin said, it was like an entire time capsule. You have everything in one box. And that made it incredibly exciting as a researcher, as, for me, as somebody who teaches African photography, I was beside myself.
And then was the first step after that? I mean, maybe not the first step, but did Sam go ahead and scan everything or a large amount so that you guys can have things in front of you? What were the initial steps to digging into this material?
Pretty immediately, Erin and I started meeting, and we met. At first, it was once a month, and we're conceiving of both book and exhibition. And at that point, we had, Erin, did we have pretty much most scans, many scans?
Yeah, I think we had, so the negatives, and Betsy, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the negatives, many of them were in manila envelopes that Todd liked to use, with sort of these old parchment paper sleeves. And so Sam was going through those negatives and scanning them for us, which was an incredible task. But then the process of labeling them and labeling them correctly was a whole nother task. And so he was scanning, and we were helping to properly identify the places that Todd had photographed, because he didn't actually name all of them, and in some cases they were named incorrectly. So there was a kind of reconciliation process that happened through the scanning and identification of images. But very quickly we were able to understand the scope of the entire trip that he had over those almost 5 months.
So initially, then you're looking at this as archivists, and you're going through the material, trying to get a sense of the scope of it. You already knew to some degree the story of the trip. So when did you, or how long was the period where then you started to say, all right, we need to get this material to other people to have their comments on it? And did all the collaborators, kind of respond to the work itself, or did you just ask them to write essays or to chime in on different aspects without seeing the work?
I can jump in. This is Erin. We've been working on this project for almost 4 years, and it was quite quickly, or quite early on, I should say, that we decided we needed to invite other voices into the project. And the writers for the book, the authors, we sent them the images we sent them selections of the images that were unedited, relating either to their country or to the topic that they were writing on, and allowed each author to make individual selections based on what they responded to personally. And we felt it was really important for the book and for the collaboration that each author work within the way that they wanted to. So we didn't really guide or suggest how they should respond to the images. And we felt we really wanted to invite more creative responses that maybe worked outside of the conventional academic book format. And I can point particularly to Emmanuel Iduma's fictional piece, for example, or the different kinds of personal histories like Rahima Chachage's piece, or Ali Ahmed's piece, or Gary Van Wyck's piece, where the authors are reflecting on their own experience on the continent through the framework of the images. And so these more creative responses were really important and offered another layer of interpretation to the images. And so to go back to the original question about the amount of time, I think it's been maybe 2 years. Aimée, correct me if I'm wrong, with working with the different authors.
Yeah, I think it has been 2 years. And this is Aimée. Because with such a vast amount of material, we wanted to make some of the research a little bit easier for the authors to allow them to dive in where they wanted to dive in. So we sent them like all the images we had, for example, of Somalia to authors who were writing, to Ali Ahmed, who was writing about Somalia. But then we also wanted to make other images available so they could see how they fit in, how the images of that country fit into the larger corpus of work. So we did want to open things up and just allow the creativity, allow authors to respond in any way that they wanted to respond. We gave authors a little bit of a word count limit because we knew that we didn't have endless space, but we also wanted everybody to take it just where they wanted to take it. Respond critically, respond creatively, however it might be. There's an interesting critique in Rahima Chachage's essay, and Rahima grew up in Tanzania, and she approaches the essay in terms of looking specifically at the relationship that she's responding to, that she sees between Todd Webb and the people that he's photographing from Tanzania. So she comes at her particular essay from a way of critiquing the images from an insider-outsider perspective, but she tells 3 stories. She tells one of the outsider, then she tells one of the imagined insiders that giving life to the people that in the photographs, and then she tells a very personal story of her own grandmother and her own grandmother baking, which is a really beautiful way to weave that through.
Todd went there on an assignment. It was through the UN. It was essentially to boost up what corporations are doing to bring, to lift Africa to a new plateau where it could be a major player in the world. Now, obviously, it was all done for economic gain, and he was sent there to document a lot of that stuff. But one of the things I found is that a lot of the photographs, the street scenes and the other photographs, there's a lot of respect. I find that he was just wide-eyed, and I get the impression in awe of everything he was seeing. A lot of the casual street scenes, they were almost like looking at pictures taken in 1950s Miami. In many, many ways, a lot of the style, there's a freshness and a brightness to it, and a lot of promise in these photographs. I find it to be very, very positive and uplifting and very fair to all the people. He's not looking down on anybody. There's no stereotyping going on here. He's treating everybody like regular people and just capturing amazingly wonderful street scenes and real life scenes. That was my take on it.
This is Betsy just jumping in. That's exactly Todd's gaze. I mean, it was just such an honest vision, and people trusted him. And he was, if anything, sometimes overly respectful, but he was very respectful of the people he was taking pictures of, and that definitely comes.
It
through.
Shows. Yeah. He's honoring these people. It's like, you get these people who are actually know that they're being photographed. You could tell it's like it's their moment, and they're being presented for who they are and what it's just really, really nice in that sense. I got some really good positive vibes from a lot of these photographs.
I would like to jump in quickly and just say, I think one of the things that we thought about, as we were considering this kind of moment of optimism that you are gesturing towards. And we sort of begin the introduction to the book with the image of the Texaco man.
Yes.
That's what we casually refer to him as, his untitled photograph. But it was also a really important part of the project to contextualize the work as a part of, or as within the legacy of colonial photography. And that we felt it was important to acknowledge the entanglement that photography has with the legacy of colonialism, and then, of course, post-colonial Africa as well. And so,
not everything worked out real good, as it turns out. No, that's for sure.
Yeah, I just think it's important to acknowledge that even if Todd is bringing a fresh perspective here, he is still working from a position of privilege and has a very specific positionality. And one of the reasons that we felt it was important to invite African voices into the conversation, and of course, we don't know what the figures in Todd's photographs would have said, right? Had we heard them at the moment that the shutter was clicked.
Right.
But we hope that we can listen to the photographs in a way now that allows for some kind of reclamation. And I think I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but the fact that the exhibition will travel to Tanzania, to the National Museum of Tanzania, and be on view there starting December 9th, which is their Independence Day this coming winter, is a really important part of that kind of reclamation that we were interested in with the project.
I wanted to add too, just in really also responding to what you're seeing in the images, Alan, is that the images were very much about a commission by the UN to document industry and technology. And Todd had hoped to publish them when he returned from his trip. He was unable to find a publisher, and there's a really great quote from his journals where he talks about, I'm not able to publish them. I think that what they want is a book of, he basically was saying, like, and I will quote it. I think that they want a picture book full of Watusi, pygmies, Maasai, lions, and women with exposed breasts.
Correct.
So, he's aware of the fact that he is photographing Africa in a very unusual way, and in a way that publishers at the time, specifically for audiences in the geographic North, that they're looking for something else. They're looking for that romanticized, exoticized image of Africa, and that's not what he shot. And
they're looking for the Tarzan movies.
Exactly. And what he shot is very different.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
However, there are many images that are not of industry and technology. They're simple street scenes, and there's a wide range of material. From your research and from his notes, or any other, any other thoughts you have on this, did he go off assignment intentionally? Did he just kind of give himself a wide berth in terms of what he could photograph? Were there other people who he was communicating with who were kind of giving him updates and pushing him in this direction? And maybe, related to that, did he have an assistant? Did he have helpers? Or was there someone from the UN who was kind of producing the trips?
I can start to answer that. This is Erin. So we know that the UN organized his itinerary and introduced him to a variety of different guides and interpreters and people on the continent. So he was very much guided by the UN Commission in that respect. We don't believe that they gave him shooting scripts in the way that Roy Stryker famously did, but he was very aware of their mandate to record industry and technology on the continent. And I do know from managing the archive for Betsy and having researched his work for Standard Oil Company, that when Todd was hired for these bigger assignments, he would regularly shoot one image for himself and one image for the assignment. And so there was this organic overlapping, I think, in his practice between his, of his vision for the assignment and for his own interests. And so it's really difficult to tease out, which image was made for the UN and which image was made for himself. And I'm not sure that's even necessary, because the fact that we can acknowledge that his vision existed in both cases, right? That he was looking at the world through his cameras, through the framework of the UN Commission, but then also with his own set of eyes. And so I think he was very much working in both respects all the time.
I mentioned earlier that with all of the color that was going on here, the UN ultimately put out a very puny little brochure that it was mostly corporate oriented. You knew nothing. It could have been taken anywhere. You'd hardly even know where the pictures were taken. They had scrubbed it so clean. After spending 5 months in an eye-opening experience photographing a place he'd never been to, was like literally a whole new world. And then to see this little black and white brochure with maybe a dozen black and white photographs in it. Any idea, how did Webb respond to this? What ultimately came out from all of his effort? Anybody have any idea if he was okay with it? I mean, I'm sure he got a nice paycheck from it, and he certainly had a lot of good photographs to take home from it. But when he looked at the actual thing of what the public saw, of what the UN saw, what was his feeling about it?
I think, it's interesting. His life in the 1950s was a series of, cobbing things together to make a living. And he always wanted to just photograph and live very simply, but obviously he had to make some money. So his walk across America, that in 55 and 56, that he had all sorts of promises from Life magazine, and that never, came through. And then he had book publishing deals that finally did come to fruition in 1960. So he, I'm sure he was very frustrated because he had, just lots of, sort of projects in the air that never came to fruition. And this was really one of them. But it's also important to remember that he only it was March 17th when he got the word that he was going to Africa. And then he left April 11th. So he didn't have much time to prepare. But he had been in Mexico for the UN before that, and he'd been also photographing for the UN in New York. So yeah, he was, and I think in the journals, Aimée and Erin, you can talk to this, that he's definitely disappointed that nothing came of it.
It had to be a letdown, because I said, you look at these photographs, this is just gorgeous stuff. There's so much there. And he was in it. You could tell he was there 1,000% in the moment in all these photographs. And then you look up this little thing that they put out, and it's like, really? God.
Well, we've all been there.
Oh yeah.
This is Aimée. We don't have in the journals anything direct where he responds. We found nothing where he responds directly to the black and white, the small black and white brochure that the UN put out. They also produced a number of black and white press photos with captions on the backs, but those were the only ways that his photographs were used. But we do know that he wanted to publish this book. And I think that he envisioned a book we don't know whether he was envisioning the color or the black and white, but there were so many color negatives that one could only imagine that he wanted to publish this as a color book.
The question I wanted to ask before, and I should have just jumped in earlier, really was about this idea to shoot in color. Can anyone speak on his decision to go forward with that? And were there any objections? Obviously it's probably a more expensive process. The film was more expensive. Did anyone stand in the way of him trying to do this?
Also, from what I understand, if I could just throw in a little thing, if I'm not mistaken, Gordon Parks is the one who actually got him interested in shooting some color initially. Is that correct? I think I remember seeing that.
Aimée, you should take this.
Yeah.
This is Aimée. So we do know that Todd went to Africa on another UN commission, he was given 25 rolls of Kodacolor to work with in Mexico. As Betsy mentioned, he did not frequently shoot in color. We do have,
Right.
and I actually really, Erin and I both searched through, and I know that Sam and Betsy have also searched through the journals looking for examples of color. But when I was writing an essay about color for the book, I really searched to find, I wanted to find other places where what was his connection to color film? But David Ritchie, who was then the chief of photographic and exhibition services at the UN, had given him 25 rolls of Kodacolor to, we could say, potentially experiment with in Mexico. And that was only a couple of months before leaving to go to Africa. On this new commission. And we do know that the UN also supplied the color film for Africa, which makes it all the more confusing why they only published the images in black and white. And we'll never know. We've done research with both Sam and Betsy through the archive, and Erin and I as well have done research with the UN trying to get more information, but we don't have the answer to that.
Could have been financial. They looked at a bean counter looked at the price of printing them in color, looking black and white, and says, "Oh, come on, it's just a picture, but black and white." It could have been as something as just an accountant, a bean counter just calling a shot. But I guess we'll never know.
Yeah, we'll never know.
One thing I also just made also what's really interesting is that if he's a black and white photographer, and that was his what most people were doing back in the day because color was relatively new. His color is as strong as his black and white. I can't say that one's better than the other. I find him to be equally masterful with color film and black and white. And I don't know if you could say that about everybody, every photographer. I think some people are better in one than the other. I think he's pretty equal.
This is Erin. I might just jump in and add a few things too. I think
please.
One thing that going back to your reference to the Gordon Parks. I know in Aimé's wonderful essay about color in the book, she talks about how in 1953, Life magazine does the first color spread. And then in 1956, 2 years before Todd leaves, Gordon Parks publishes his seminal color photo essay, Restraints Open and Hidden, which was on segregation in Alabama. And so there is those are the precedents for it being published in the United States. What's interesting is that the department that hires Todd from the UN is the UN Office of Information. And the UN Office of Information is the one that publishes the brochure. And so the questions that we have about this remain sort of rooted in questions about the documentary photograph. And did the UN believe that the documentary photograph carried more weight as fact in the black and white form than it did in color? And we don't have the answers, right? But these are the questions that we're asking in terms of the interpretation of these images by the UN.
Interesting. I did want to ask quickly about the interview that you have in the book with James Barner, and perhaps using that as a springboard to talk a little bit about photography in the countries that Webb visited while he was there. Again, I think it's just a great inclusion into the book and gives a perspective that is called for.
It was such an honor to interview him, and we did a Zoom interview. This is pre-pandemic when I hadn't even used Zoom that often, and now we're on it all the time. He had an active photo studio at the time, the Ever Young photographic studio in Accra, Ghana, and he was actively photographing at the time that Todd Webb was there. And he both shared his insight into photography in Ghana in the 1950s, and he also looked at Todd Webb's images and just talked about some of the images too, and talked about photographing in color. James Barner was also, he had moved to London in the early 60s, I believe, but he moved back to Ghana bringing through Agfa Gevert, the first color processing photo lab. So he was the person to open that with Agfa Gevert in Accra, Ghana in 1969. Which also gives us insight to this. This was the first color photo processing lab in Ghana. So we have African countries who are starting to do color processing in the late 60s. And I'm not sure actually when the first color processing labs were in different countries in Africa.
For somebody who had, and I'm speaking of Todd Webb, somebody who had such a, I don't want to call it a great career, but who certainly did some wonderful assignments and had some notoriety. He was involved in some very important exhibitions earlier in his career. How would you, sum up his thoughts on photography and in his later years? There seemed to be some reservations as to chasing down images that were his, and even maybe a bit of discouragement on how his work was received. Is that true, or was he satisfied with his life's work? Was he, did he want to continue shooting as he got older? How did he think about photography as he got older?
He was pretty satisfied with a lot that he did. His wife, Lucille, was wonderful and, helped him along. She was the practical one. And so I think I sensed more from her than from him, the not quite disappointment, but frustration a little bit, because Harry Callahan was, his best friend, and Harry, just enjoyed all this sort of fame and that sort of thing. And they were just, it would rail at her a little bit. She just wasn't really happy about that. So she was always, always, always his best, sort of promoter. But yeah, so I think, and then there was, so in fact, when he lost this stuff in 1976 to this dealer, he did sort of throw in the towel a little bit in terms of just promoting himself and that sort of thing. So, but Todd wasn't that kind of person. That's the thing. And that's sort of what he and I related a lot about, because I had been, mixed up in the New York, go a little bit when I worked for Mapplethorpe and all that stuff, and had seen sort of what it takes to make it. And, I didn't like that either. So I think that was something that we both just innately knew about each other. But so I think, but I don't think he was certainly not frustrated. I mean, I think he was very happy about his life's work.
Okay, just a phenomenal talking with you guys about a phenomenal photographer. And one last question, and I'll toss this out to whoever wants to grab it. Aimée, Erin, Betsy, who chose the cover photo? Because there's a lot to choose from, and why was that picture chosen?
So this is Aimée. I'll jump in, and I would love Betsy and Erin for you to add as well. It was, as you can imagine, a really long process with Erin and myself and Betsy and Sam. We also consulted the other authors on the book with a couple of the choices. The Thames and Hudson crew were incredible. The book designer was amazing, but we ended with the photo of the man walking on the street in Mogadishu in that incredible red suit, because it carried...
I want a suit like that. That's great.
I know. I think we all do. It carried a really beautiful resonance of, I think, a story that we want to carry through the book, which is that these images are very unique for that era. For that type of photography, they don't present the typical exoticizing image of Africa for the most part. They present another story that we wanted to also unpack. Erin and Betsy, do you remember your thoughts in the?
I can jump in. This is Erin. I think one of the things that we wanted the cover image to carry forward was the invitation to have conversations, sometimes difficult ones, sometimes exciting ones, about these photographs, and be able to discuss what is seen inside the frame and also what exists outside the frame. And we felt like this image was able to do that on the cover of the book, to gesture towards both what is contained within those four sides of the photographic image, and also to gesture outward more expansively to the stories that are not visible on the surface of that print.
Would it be safe to assume that Texaco Man was a runner-up for the cover?
Absolutely.
It was. We talked about
Whenever I
that.
think of the book, my mind goes directly to that picture. It is such a powerful photo. It's a wonderful photograph, and it's so powerful.
And the two women, this is Betsy, and the Somali women in the yellow dresses on the beach.
Yes.
And I have to say also the man in the Santa mask.
From Togo.
Oh, okay.
But we felt that's as a jarring and sort of, an image that is, we felt that was not, it might be too much. So
needless to say, to our listeners, I'm speaking right now, the volume of photography and the quality of photography and the story that they tell, because these are photographs of a place that I would say that 99 and 9/10% of our audience has no idea about it. We've never seen it. It's a thin slice of a narrow portion in time in Africa that was a turning point that had a lot of optimism going on there. And there was insidiousness also. And again, we all know how a lot of it worked out. But as a moment in time captured and documented, it's just a flawless piece of work, and it's well worth investigating.
I think it's important to mention that there is an accompanying exhibition to the book, which is open right now at the Minneapolis Institute of Art and will be open through the 13th of June. So I hope your listeners can check out their online exhibition if they can't make their way to Minneapolis.
Excellent, excellent. Betsy, can you give us an idea of some of the links that people can go to if they want to see more of Mr. Webb's work?
Well, we at our archive, it's www.toddwebbarchive.com, and it's we have an online viewing room of the Africa work, and in the archive section we have links to all the rest of his different bodies of work, and then the Minneapolis Institute of Art, which has their own website, and they have an online viewing room.
That's great. I urge all of our listeners to follow up on this. Again, if you're into photography, you're in for a treat. Okay, another wrap of another show. As I always say, we can go on, but time is a real factor here. Aimée, Erin, Betsy, thank you so much for joining us today. Fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed it. And also a special shout out again to Audio-Technica for the use of the BP40 microphones on today's show. If you enjoy listening to the B&H Photography Podcast, let the Bean Counters know exactly how much you love us by subscribing to the show. All you have to do is go to Spotify or wherever you snag your favorite podcast and type in B&H Photography Podcast, hit enter, and boom, you are family. And if you're already a subscriber, leave a nice comment. The boss reads these things too. You can also find us on the B&H Explorer website and on the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group page. Unless told otherwise, my name is Alan Weitz, and on behalf of John Harris and Jason Tables, thank you so much for tuning in today.